CASAT Podcast Network.
Welcome to Season 2 of CASAT Conversations. I am your host, Heather Haslam. This season, we will explore the timely and complex topic of resilience for healthcare providers. Within each conversation, you will hear from experts, clinicians, and providers who will explore and share the latest research, best practices, and applications for how to be resilient. Please enjoy today's conversation. Dr. Ungar is the author of 17 books for lay and professional audiences and over 200 peer-reviewed papers and book chapters. These include Change Your Life, The Science of Resilience and the True Path to Success, a book for adults experiencing stress and work and home, and I Still Love You, 9 Things Troubled Teens Need for Their Parents. His blog, Nurturing Resilience, can be read on Psychology Today's website. I can't think of a better person to kick us off in our second season as we explore the topic of resilience for healthcare providers, and so we are just delighted to have you here today. Welcome, Dr. Ungar.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks. Appreciate the invitation.
So as we get started, I'd love to hear, how did you get into this work?
I guess a bit of a combination of personal life experience of having had to grow up very young and emancipate my own self at 16. That kind of got me interested in people's pathways through life and how we cope, how people kind of come out of that kind of adversity. I've written a fair bit about that in a book I published earlier called I Still Love You. It's all about raising kids. But I also, just by the work I was doing as a clinical social worker, family therapist, and other sort of roles that I fulfilled in community mental health, and just kept meeting people who were doing better than expected. You know, people you just think, okay, just the burden of life has gotten to weigh them down. And yet they surprise you with that, what sometimes is referred to as post-traumatic growth, or that positive gains from adversity. It goes by different terms, but this idea that, these are people who often come through great hardship and they still would be inspiring in terms of the choices they were making and how they were coping. So, the kid who's, comes out of that and gets on to college, the parent who overcomes, a child's incredible illness as a caregiver, and they still kind of move forward. Not to mention people who have, as refugees who have come through great, trauma in terms of past war experiences and stuff. And in every case, you see people who have just sort of beaten the odds. Now, it was kind of curious, though, because as a social scientist in this field, which is dominated by mostly psychological sciences, I began to find myself asking a slightly different set of questions that was not just about what it took internally for someone to do and thrive despite adversity. Where my work began to take me over time was also to figure out, well, what was it about people's environments? And I very memorably had this kid that I was working with when I started this voyage back probably now about 2 decades ago. And I was speculating on she'd just done this amazing thing, came out of a very violent home and had managed to stay in school and not use drugs and not get pregnant before 16 and all the other things that are so the risk markers for this kid. And when I said, you must have incredible perseverance or whatever, she looked at me going, you don't get it, do you? You're not that bright, essentially, is what she was saying. And what she was trying to say, of course, was, what she kind of then informed me was, no, I just, there was that teacher who believed in me. There was I had a certain set of talents and some opportunities to use them. Unlike my sister who hasn't done quite so well in life. And I think that it was these little moments of sort of light in the darkness that sort of said, wait. Maybe we think too narrowly about what makes us resilient. Even during the pandemic or other great crisis, we always have been thinking it's about mindset. And I began to sort of challenge that idea that maybe it wasn't just mindset or our individual ruggedness, that it was also, and this is what my work really began to show, it was also about the resources we had around us. And that resonated with me personally in terms of my own also life experience. The teachers who believed in me, some of the opportunities I had when I began to sort of basically have to make my way in life very, very young.
I love this that you highlighted little moments of light along the path that have kind of led you to where you are today. I've experienced that in my own career as well. And there's certain moments that stick out that are very pivotal for the way that I think about the world and expands my thinking. And this young woman who you met so many years ago, hearing how she influenced your work. Very cool.
Yeah, those little tiny opportunities that sometimes redirect you in different ways, whether it's a friendship, a lover, an opportunity for a job. I memorably, in fact, I don't think I was on my best game when I guess I was just in my early 20s, and I was applying for work in a youth shelter in Montreal. And it was definitely not I was off a little bit. I just had a whole bunch of change in my life, and I went for this job interview and needed a job, and I went through the job interview, and I knew I'd blown it. Oh my God, it was awful. I'd missed all the scenarios. One of those things you just go, you leave. Anyways, 2 days later, the boss who interviewed calls me up, and he says, "You got the job." There's this long pause on my part on the phone. And eventually, his name was Michael. I said, "Michael, why are you hiring me?" He says, "Well, if you want to know the honest truth, you were the best of the worst." And I hope that I exceeded his expectations once I got in the job, and we ended on great terms, and the job was very successful, and he did a lot of neat stuff with it and innovative and stuff. And, it was a launch to many other things in my life, including further education. But there are those serendipitous moments in our lives, which are also part of resilience. And often they're about opportunity structures around us. And, sometimes we just cope better with the chronic stress of a workplace in turmoil, or when there are those, someone remembers our birthday in the job site, or there's that barista down at the local coffee shop who just remembers our order every morning, and the routine of that. There's these little tiny things. Anne Maston talks about the everyday magic that keeps us more resilient. But let's be real clear, it also means having environments and stable housing, and sometimes just someone who's willing to give you a chance even after you've blown the job interview.
That's such a great example of opportunities and how they just arise in moments that we need them.
Yeah.
You mentioned the rugged individual, and in your book you mentioned really the difference between a rugged individual and a resource individual. Can you describe that for us?
Yeah, sure. So in Change Your World, what I really wanted to get at was that so much of this resilience discourse, how we talk about it, is focused on mindfulness, on mindset. And I think sometimes we forget that even the Buddhist monk sitting in the monastery high atop the mountain, who's doing this incredible neuroplasticity exercise of rewiring their brain and all the stuff that we've been talking about as foundational to well-being, they are still dependent on a community of supports around them to have children, raise crops, bring groceries up the mountain, feed them, cook for them, so that they can pursue their spiritual path. And I'm often amazed that we've been so caught up with this notion of individual ruggedness. I mean, Herbert Hoover, 1928, makes this famous speech in the United States that talks about the American rugged individual. I mean, and it was the roaring 20s, right? It was economic everything, perfectly, good jobs, as long as you were sort of male, white, heterosexual, et cetera, et cetera. But let's, the idea here was that basically that, the rugged individual could pursue with total autonomy their own life course. And then funny how that kind of 1931 comes along, and suddenly where government has to intervene. You need food banks and government projects and other supports because the whole stock market had crashed. And suddenly, wow, what happened to rugged individualism? Oh, that was only good idea when there's lots of money sloshing around in the economy, and therefore, and of course, only for those who have the privilege because of their social location to access it. So, it was ideas like this, looking historically, but it was also in the current moment that say, when I meet people working in, say, healthcare providers, and we begin to think about what is it that creates an intrinsic set of motivation to push through a period of change, or that your workload is just excessive, you can't help but think that, when you walk down the street and your neighbors are out hanging outside their windows, banging pots in celebration of their healthcare workers in their community who are pushing through a crisis, or you begin to think about unions that stand up for workers' rights and make sure that you're safe on the job, or maybe it's just a colleague who's willing to, to sort of, create an environment in the workplace that's a little bit better. Those kinds of things trigger a better mindset as well. So I like to think of it, maybe it's more like a ping pong game, a rugged individual set of qualities, a positive mindset, optimism towards the future, hopefulness. These things tend to make us more likely to take advantage of relationships. The science on that is pretty clear. But better relationships, fairer treatment, also triggers optimism. So cart and horse begin to sort of play this little dance back and forth that if I, for instance, want to make somebody more optimistic or better able to withstand stress in the workplace, I can either change their brain or I can change the circumstances around them or work with them to advocate for changes in the environment as well. So for instance, if someone's being tasked to do endless, to take on more and more and more at work, and they're feeling completely overwhelmed by it, often what I'll say to them, okay, well, your boss is giving you all this. Have you actually turned around to your boss and said, hey, I know I'm supposed to just adapt and somehow do my self-regulation, deep breathing exercises or something like that to cope with your insanity. But why don't we just have the boss say, look, here's my day today. I have 14 patients that require this amount of care. Here's the prescriptions that I have to do. Here's the prescribed protocols I have to obey. I'm really struggling. I don't see the number of hours in my day to accomplish all this, but you've obviously assigned it to me, so you must have a pathway forward. You obviously know how to do this. Can you just show me what I'm supposed to do to accomplish this task in the time that you've given me? Because obviously you've given it to me, you must know. And then the supervisor can go, I haven't a friggin' clue. Or they can actually go, yeah, that's not actually realistic. Or maybe they actually do know how to do that job and to do all 14 patient tasks, et cetera, in that time allotment, in which case you'd be getting the mentorship and the support and the coaching that you would require to then survive it. So I often say to people, there's a bit of with resilience, you're often too focused on adaptation. And if I might, we're not focused enough on transformation, which is changing the circumstances around us rather than adapting ourselves to what can sometimes be very toxic environments.
I love this reframe of really what we think resilience is. I think there's a very different perception in our society that really speaks to that rugged individualism and people who have dealt with really difficult situations in their life and who have bounced back. But really, when you look underneath the surface, there are resources around them that have built them up. And this analogy of the ping pong makes so much sense to me.
And it is interesting. If you actually, take the moment to ask people who have come through those great adversities, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 100 will basically have a story that's all about them. They have the right personality, certain, they are the people who can, the Nelson Mandelas who can be in prison for 27 years and still find it in their souls to forgive their jailers. It is, it is the people who have come through Auschwitz without their spirits being completely squashed. It is those kinds of individuals, the refugees you meet who've, still, work in very low-paying jobs, though they had much higher qualifications before. They, there are spirits that do endure. But the problem with that, focusing only on those few exemplars, is that we miss sometimes the conditions that make the other 99 people out of the 100 actually do well. And it's I share a stage often as a scientist. I often share a stage with motivational speakers who bring their own personal story. And I'm inspired by their stories as well. But I do struggle sometimes to say, what has this got to do with the other people in your audience? Because what you've implied is, unless you show the same strength as me and are every bit as motivated and together and inspiring as me, then you won't succeed. And for me, that is a terrible message. I think that I'd rather bank myself and saying, hey, what if I could come up with a formula that actually gave the other 99 people in the room the chance to actually be successful? So if I told you, for instance, rather than just focusing on going off to the meditation studio or the yoga studio and buying your Lululemon yoga mat, there's my little pitch for Lululemon, Canadian company. Thank you very much. I'm actually not sponsored by them, but that would be kind of cool if I was. Thanks. But I mean, okay, so you're going to go to that yoga studio. But what we actually understand is that if you're stressed, in your morning routines with your kids, say you have a family and you have to get the kids to daycare and everything, and then you're going to rush through your morning and then rush to this yoga studio and sit there and deep breathe for 45 minutes and stretch or something. And then you're going to return to your chaos of your job and then the chaos of after school activities with your kids and meals and specials, whatever. The chances, we know scientifically, by the way, that the chances of that little moment of deep breathing and stretching will have almost no impact on your long-term health outcomes, because it's sandwiched between so much other chaos. But if before you sign up for the yoga studio, you ask your spouse, your father-in-law, your neighbor to help you with your childcare responsibilities twice a week, so that your day is a little bit more calmer and you've increased your social network, you may just actually see much more of a long-term sustainable benefit from that particular more introspective, physically focused individual exercise. So what we're beginning to understand is that, and I'm not completely out of whack with where medical sciences are going. You may have heard the phrase social prescriptions.
I have
where
not.
No, this is a catching trend where what they're actually, you go to your doctor, you say, I have a headache all night, I'm really stressed, I'm feeling lonely, I'm feeling depressed, whatever. And they say, well, here, I'm going to write you a script. And the script is, go to a movie with a friend. And here's 2 movie passes. I'm going to have you go for a walk in the park, or I'm going to have you routinely go to the same coffee shop every day, or I'm going to have you, do something, celebrate someone else's birthday. Think about that. I'm going to give you a script of social connections rather than a medication, a psychopharmacological intervention. And what they're beginning to find is that there's the efficacy of these treatments is actually quite high in terms of changing people's experiences. So again, we can work just on ourselves, or we can work a bit on the environment around us. And what we're beginning to understand is that those adaptations are sometimes help us, move us along, or as Richard Thaler, who's an economist, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, has talked about, that we create environmental nudges to push us in the direction in which we want people to act, and ourselves as well, to actually go.
This idea of social prescriptions makes so much sense to me as we look at long-term well-being and health outcomes and the impact of social isolation. I'm delighted to know the term for it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
So you mentioned the formula. I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on the formula for resilience. What does that look like?
Well, I guess I would boil it down to a couple of key concepts that the research we've been doing globally has been sort of repeating over and over. And that is this idea of, first of all, we're more resilient when we're able to navigate to the resources we need. So that does take a certain amount of motivation, but it also means that the resources we need are within proximity to us. So that means about finding, a workplace that's a little more accommodating, a transportation system that will get you there, good food, a safe place to sleep that's relatively quiet, a place to exercise or to move, these kinds of things, relationships that will keep you supported and safe and energized, fulfilling work and all these things. So this is all about navigating to the resources we need. But the other second concept that's come out of my work has been this idea of negotiating, so that what you ask for and are given is what's meaningful to you. The problem is sometimes what's happened is, and we often see this, say, with our workplaces, that our employers will provide us with something, maybe a monetary incentive. And what we've actually seen is that people don't always respond well to monetary incentives. What they sometimes want is simply a more flexible work schedule. They might want more training opportunities, opportunities for promotion, or maybe just the opportunity to connect with their fellow employees and create a sense of community, a community of practice, or something like this. So it's often about negotiating. So if I need, supports for something, the question always is, am I getting the right resource that matches my needs? So there's always a game of back and forth with my environment to say, this is actually what I need for this particular situation. And for that reason, you often see, so if someone comes to me and they say, I'm just feeling awful, I'm depressed or whatever, I'm disconnected, I usually start with, first of all, what does that actually mean? Or if they say they want connections, I would never make the assumption that I understand that. Such even a word like relationships, I would never underestimate that I understand that. Are we talking about one solid friend? Are we talking about you want to walk down the street and have people high five you, many times? Are you talking about, a level of intimacy or just a sense of general acknowledgement? All of those factors are going to shape what a relationship actually looks like for you. And as a consequence, if you're going to try and help someone, you're going to really need to get engaged in this dance of meaning systems so that you don't get it wrong. And culturally, I think I haven't really, I think in the background to everything we've just talked about here, Heather, but culture really plays a huge fly in the ointment here a little bit, because it determines what you do find meaningful. If I say family to, someone, I don't know, a typical, family, a person who's moved away to another part of the country is just with their own little spouse and maybe a child or something like that, family is going to mean something quite different than if I'm in a more traditional extended family network in Greece, in a village in Greece, or for that matter, in an indigenous community in the Arctic of Canada or something like that. So even a concept like family is highly flexible and culturally determined, as are often indicators of success. What is it to be successful? What is it to feel respected by your community? Does it matter? These are all really determined by other things. So, I can imagine as healthcare professionals, people often what is it that actually brings a sense of respect and meaning? How's your job perceived by others? And that identity carries us through a tough time. I mean, if I'm perceived by others as somebody who's very successful in my community and my family, think of what I'm doing as really meaningful, then when I'm in a tough period of time, I'm more likely to push through. I'm more likely to have the intrinsic motivators to say, this job is meaningful, this is important to other people, and I get acknowledgement for that. That's what's going to push me through. If you're in a job description, maybe I'm not picking on any profession, but say, I don't know, maybe you're an occupational therapist and your parents don't even understand what that is, right? You're not a doctor, you're not a nurse, and you're not a X. What is this OT thing? I'm totally picking on OT. I have no reason to do that at all. I love OTs, whatever. But if you're outside of the zone, right? If you're outside of a recognition of another, in the same way, you can even get the other ways. I've heard sometimes medical doctors who sometimes have a certain elevated status because of perceptions of others will actually get the reverse, is that sometimes like their families, they'll come back and say, I'm really exhausted. The work is really stressful. I don't know if I want to continue with this profession or whatever. And their family goes, why would you ever quit that? Like, it's a perfect job. How could it be anything else but perfect? Well, hang on. No, it's actually kind of, incredibly repetitive. And if you're a family doc and you don't get to see your patients much more than 3 to 5 minutes on a visit, and you don't build really sustaining relationships, and like there is this kind of, we sometimes forget that a lot of what we experience is in part related to how others in our cultural space define us, and what we consider meaningful, and indeed what keeps us going.
I'm aware of in our first season, we interviewed first responder family members. And we talked with firefighters. So this is frontline workers. And we interviewed firefighter families and police families. And the difference in the cultural perception between fire and police in our current world is very different. And so to hear about the stressors that police families experience was fascinating. And there are some real challenges when we look at those cultural perceptions to resilience. I'm curious if you have any insights or thoughts about that.
Well, yes, because each of our jobs is going to bring us a different set of stressors. It's an interesting idea that sometimes we forget when we're talking about resilience. We're actually talking about, the simplest way I explain this is sort of 3 columns to make it simple. You need to know what is the danger or what is the threat that you're experiencing. What is the risk that you're experiencing? So I guess a family of a firefighter is probably experiencing a slightly different stress than the family of a police officer, especially depending on the community you're in and how much gun violence there is and that type of thing. The other one you always want is the 3rd column, is the outcomes. What are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to achieve a certain sense of safety, security, peace of mind, or is it just that sense of contribution to the welfare of others? Like, is that your goal? And then in the middle between these 2 columns, this kind of risk exposures and these outcomes, we're always thinking about what is the right protective factor that's going to get us there. So, I kind of understand why, police and firefighters are, organize themselves and they're, a very solid, cohesive kind of workplace community, because they need each other, and chances are the families will need each other should a crisis occur. I mean, I don't really think of IT professionals working on developing the latest gaming system going, we really got to have our families meet on the weekends together because it's super important that we all pull together. I don't know. Maybe IT specialists do it. Maybe. But I'm going to go on a limb and probably say no. Now, but the point is that different risk profiles, different threats to us require different responses to achieve different outcomes. And I think that, if you're really thinking about this from your own point of view, I mean, if you're a healthcare professional, I'm a healthcare professional, the kinds of people that I'm working with will change the kinds of peace of mind I want, as well as, of course, the kinds of supports I need along the way. I've been intrigued, for instance, if I might, by colleagues of mine working on this concept of vicarious resilience. More people are almost much more familiar with vicarious trauma. I sort of sit in a room with people who have been badly traumatized, sexually abused, et cetera, tortured, and I'm going to, like, it Velcros to me. I carry home that stress, and I need ways of shedding that stress, of sort of, parting myself from those experiences, and remind. And as someone trained in the psychotherapies, I do have my own techniques. I was trained in how you, at the end of a day, you make certain gratitude statements, or you make certain statements of self-efficacy, such as, did I do everything I could do today as efficiently as I possibly could to help the most people? And if I did, then I fulfilled my mandate and I can go home, sort of thing. But when we're also talking about, listening to stories of people who have gone through incredible hardship and coped, and eliciting those from folks and paying attention to those, has been found to have a really positive impact on our belief in humanity, our sense of what's the possible in the world. So again, we're talking about, like, do we take advantage of, do we only ask people, well, tell me what your illness and tell me what medications you're on and tell us what your problems are, and how did you, what kind of accommodation do you need in your home to go home? Or do you also spend a few minutes to talk to people about, well, how have you gotten this far? Who supported you to get this far as you did, and what kinds of supports, and how do you cope daily with such a debilitating illness or whatever? I mean, to tune into some of those stories might also just give us, at the end of a day, this vicarious resilience, a sense of, wow, the human spirit is endlessly creative. There's so much possibility, and our communities are endlessly supportive, that there's more love and cohesion out there than I would have ever thought possible. And imagine, getting on the bus at the end of a shift with that in your head, rather than thinking, oh my God, the human race, oh, what a waste of time. You get on the bus with
Mm-hmm.
that attitude, right? It's two very different perspectives. And as a consequence, you're going to see the world and you're going to experience every people as they react to you. You're going to experience them and what they do very differently as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I had not heard of vicarious resilience. I love that phrase. Thank you. So, with the research you've done on systems, I'm curious, how does the healthcare system impact a provider's resilience?
Well, that's a great question because it it does exactly what we're talking about here, which is shifts the conversation from just the rugged qualities of the healthcare provider to the more systemic responses. I actually just put out an edited volume with the Oxford University Press called Multi-Systemic Resilience. And the good news is it's an open access, so anybody around the world can read the chapters. Now they're very academic, to be fair, but the sum total of them, because they're from all these different, everything from literally computer specialists who talk about resilience, to architects who talk about resilience, psychologists, epigeneticists, just this concept of resilience cuts across many different fields. But the core message is that all of these systems are tied together. And if you think about almost like dominoes in a circle, if you knock over one, it tends to have a cascade of effects around the circle and all the other dominoes. And it doesn't really matter where you start. So a system like the healthcare system that then pays and organizes the workload of a healthcare provider is by definition then one of the systems which itself has to be resilient. It has to have the capacity to withstand stress. And as we saw during the pandemic, when those systems were either underfunded, overstressed, or dysfunctional, they could not support their workers well enough. Now, fortunately, workers themselves are systems as too, and they had their own capacities to cope. But the idea is that the more of these systems that are working well, the more likely you are to have that sort of domino effect or cascade of influences, so that the resilience of one system influences the resilience of other, what I say, co-occurring systems. But basically what I'm just trying to get at is imagine those healthcare systems had anticipated after SARS and other pandemics, the potential, they had actually stockpiled PPE, that they had understood that resilience is the process of preparing for that next crisis. Those moments, if we all had N95 masks in plenty back in the storage room, anticipating the next major crisis. If in my country, in Canada, of course, we didn't have any capacity, national capacity to produce vaccines. Why is an absolute mind boggle, but that is not it wasn't attributable to any one political party in power. It was just something that happened periodically over time. There was always a sense that we would be served by other countries. And of course, that very quickly became apparent was not going to be the case. That, in a crisis, it's everyone jump into their own lifeboat and start paddling. So what you began to, these systems are nested inside other systems, but the more that they are functioning well prior to a crisis, the better we get through a crisis, which really does mean that I do wish we'd even out some of the conflict between the government systems and the unions. I wish we'd get people into healthier workplaces. I wish we would not be so stressed on the number of people that we are always employing, or that we would rationalize some of the services and having people who could do some of the tasks that we now, in a sense, we require people with more, maybe too many more qualifications that are necessary for those particular jobs. I'm thinking of, for instance, the classic one here is the nurse practitioners. That really, come on, if my kid has the flu or whatever, do I really need to see a family physician, or do I just need a nurse practitioner? Could we create more complementarity? If there's certain medications, surely my pharmacist could prescribe those. Like, really, do we really need to go and bother my physician? Especially when there's such shortages of family physicians and people are relying on drop-in clinics and this type of thing. In other words, the power to change these things are within our capacity, but we have to begin to think about these resilient systems and prior to the next crisis. So before, tens of thousands of people don't have family physicians, why weren't the medical professionals talking about diversifying who's doing what across all the different disciplines? That would have been resilience. Otherwise, what you're seeing is just a reactive sort of, let's just quickly change. And this unfortunately is the case. And it cuts. By the way, let's not pick on healthcare professionals. It's the same in education. Where I live in Nova Scotia, it's a province of approximately 1 million people. About 7% of our kids didn't have access to the internet. Now, I live in one of the most modern countries on earth, one of the wealthiest people on earth ever to exist, and we had about 1 in 13 of our kids in our cities, in our communities, couldn't access the internet. Like, this is a solvable problem, a very relatively easy to solve problem in terms of So when the pandemic hit, suddenly it was like, oh no, we have money for whether it was internet connections or hotspots or indeed Chromebooks or to give kids access to technology and everything else. But why wasn't that done before? Why did we have to wait till a crisis of that magnitude before we understood? And so I guess what I'm sort of a bit of always sort of looking at these how we create robust systems to respond. And I learned that, by the way, what's neat about when you start working with architects and IT specialists and everything else, you begin to sort of introduce into your language words like redundancies. When you build a computer system, you build in multiple redundancies so that if one part of the system fails, the other systems don't completely catastrophically go down. When you begin to you think of what tolerances you have for major screw ups and this type of thing, and I guess if you can kind of begin to introduce those feedback loops and those redundancies and other things, you begin to get more robust systems that are able to withstand more stress. You can do that as an individual. So if I can't pick up my kids after school because I have to work an extra shift here at the hospital, well, my mother is my backup. She is my redundancy, right? But it works kind of the other way, is that, do you have redundancies built into systems so that if suddenly you have a lot of staff that go on stress leave or something like that, do you have enough kind of capacity in the back? Are you training enough people in the medical schools and the nursing schools and the other healthcare professionals? And have you flexed your laws enough? And are you allowing immigrants to come to this company and re-credentialing them and that type of thing? Are you doing all these things so that your system is actually going to be overall stronger and able to withstand the stress? And when we begin to think like that, ultimately what we're doing is we're creating robust systems that have a cascade effect so that people in those systems, even if they're not individually strong, they're able to withstand stress much more because the system around them is built for them to kind of hold them while they're getting, whatever they need to cope as well.
I'm really aware of my hope that, as we are coming out of the pandemic, I think we can sort of say that. I don't know if we can, but as we continue to be in the pandemic and move through it, I'll say, it's my hope that this time has really shined a light on some of these cracks in the system. And we have people like you who can help strengthen the systems and change the way we think about them.
Thanks. I mean, the good news is that I've been working with, at the federal level, policy horizons, sometimes with UN bodies, lots of different government institutions. There is a real conversation now, finally, I think, about resilience and about community resilience and institutional resilience, as well as individual resilience. We probably hear most about the individual one, but there is a strong push by governments and institutions and to actually make the systems much more resilient as well, so that the next time there's a crisis, we just do a lot better, whether it's a wildfire, this type of thing. There's just, and people are beginning to think like that, eh? Like, I was amazed when there was wildfires outside of, in northern Alberta, Fort McMurray, this back a couple of years ago now, through the wildfires, forced the evacuation of 85,000 people from a community. 2,500 structures were burnt to the ground, etc. People were massively displaced. But what caught my attention was that the insurance companies had actually learned from that experience before in other natural disasters. And what they actually learned was that they needed to respond quicker to get people's insurance claims settled and people rebuilding. And that had a profound impact on people's experiences of trauma. Because, of course, if you're rebuilding, you're back in your community, you're reconnected, you have a hope for the future, you sense your sense of control in your life, all these intrinsic qualities which we know are associated with resilience. So what the insurance companies did was they put their insurance adjusters onto those buses that the rock bands use that you can sleep on, and they began to go around to all the shelters where people had been displaced to. And they actually started people's insurance claims. One, the buses meant that the people on the buses weren't a burden on the local infrastructure. So they weren't relying on, the local restaurants and the local sleeping quarters and everything else. But it also meant that they could very quickly initiate people's insurance claims, or the banks did it as well in terms of getting people money and everything. And that kind of quick response is as or more important, given, again, going back to my 3 columns, the risk exposure, the kind of outcome you want, what is the right protective mechanism? Well, if you've just had your house burned to the ground in a community that's evacuated, you don't need a psychologist. No offense to the mental health professionals like myself out there. We're needed. We're just not needed at that particular moment. You need your insurance adjuster first, then the mental health professional afterwards, whether a clinical social worker or otherwise. So it's a bit of that kind of, again, thinking about this connection between the protective factors and Heather, you've been hinting at this, but not just at the individual level, the rugged qualities, but this idea of also changing our world. Change your world, the whole thing I'm trying to get at in that book is that idea that, these changes at this systemic level of the insurance adjuster getting on a bus is likely to have a dramatic effect on your mental well-being as you feel back in control of your life and you begin to rebuild your house.
What a great example of systems that have learned from the past and then implementing it to make our lives better. Starting to, yeah. I'm curious, resilience seems like a really hot topic right now. And so I'm curious if you've been in this world for many years. What is the shift that you've seen? And are you just getting busier and busier?
Definitely busier and busier. I would say that the shift was this more social kind of idea of resilience that I'm explaining has become much, much more popular. When I began this work back in the 90s, late 80s, 90s, contemporaries at that time, or people who were sort of generations in front of me who had figured out a lot of stuff, were all very focused on the individual, psychological, maybe some relational ideas like, who's in your family. And I remember when I first started trying to get some of my work published, it was a bit of a tough slog because people would say, well, it's really more individual than social. But over time, what's actually happened is there's been this huge shift in the people who are propagating that sort of message around the individual. Now they're talking about social justice issues. They're talking about fair access to good health care. They're talking that there's that these aspects of our community's resilience. There was the Rockefeller 100 community experiments, etc. We have large foundations of people suddenly saying, no. Our individual resilience is tied up with our community's resilience, our social services resilience, our government's resilience. And those messages are no longer a tough sell. I like to think that maybe I've had a small contribution to that change of conversation, but it is now not such a reach to hear governments talk about we need to create a resilience plan for our government, with the hope that then the more resilient we are, the better we'll be able to serve the needs of our citizens, and those citizens then will be able to cope with more stress and hopefully get through and continue to thrive. So that's been, for sure, the policy forms. People are just beginning to think about this kind of strengthening. And the nice thing is we're getting better at the indicators. So this idea of social justice, can you really have resilience without social justice? One of the problems back in the late 80s, early 90s, even coming into the new millennium, was that there were certain groups that really hated the term resilience. I quite often got pushback from, say, indigenous communities, because there was always the implied tone of sort of this colonizing language or other kinds of this blaming the victim kind of talk, right? That, oh, well, so-and-so did well. This kid got to university. Therefore, why isn't everybody in this community doing well? Well, it's a kind of a crappy argument to say, so you're not going to resource enough people, and then you're going to say just because one person gets through, everybody else should. And somehow really the message is blaming everybody else for their failures, quote unquote. And that failure in quotation marks, because of course people don't perceive it that way. So there was a pushback, like, stop blaming us. Look at the systems around us, what's stacked against us, right? That we can't succeed. There was a really kitschy movie called The Pursuit of Happiness. Will Smith plays this kind of father of a boy, and they end up sleeping in the toilets in the subway system in New York, and he can solve a Rubik's Cube really quickly, and eventually he enchants his way, and through great grit and determination and everything else, he manages to become a stockbroker or some sort of thing like that, right? What bothers me, I mean, the movie's good and all, but what bothers me about that movie is there's not a nod in there anywhere. The fact that Will Smith is black, and he's about to go and get a job on Wall Street. And the odds of him, that story probably could not have been told 30, 20 years earlier. Because even with all that grit and determination and the brilliance that this man has, I don't think those doors would have been open the same way because of the racism that would have occurred in that particular situation. Now, I'm just, I'm white. I don't want to speak outside of my own social location on this. But my understanding of the stories I've told and the people I've met said that there would have been incredible barriers to the Will Smith character in that movie succeeding. So can we really have a conversation about resilience if we're not also talking about social justice and opportunity structures? Can we really talk about, if you're a nurse practitioner or whatever, and you don't have, union representation, or maybe it doesn't union, but at least a fair practices, that you don't have sort of, safety protocols in your workplace? I mean, can we really talk about, individual coping without also talking about social and other factors that make it possible for us to become our best and boldest selves? And that, these other kinds of things, they are part of this conversation as well.
Mm-hmm. Resilience is such a complex topic, and one that we're excited to explore this season. I want to thank you, Michael, for joining us today. It's been a delight. You were just a wealth of information. I feel like I could ask you questions for hours, but I'm aware of our time. So again, just thank you for sharing all of your knowledge and expertise, and thank you for helping to change the world.
All the best to you, Heather. All the best. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to CASAT Conversations, your resource for exploring behavioral health topics. We hope you found today's conversation timely and meaningful. Please share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. If you want to learn more, visit us at our blog at CASATOnDemand.org.
CASAT Podcast Network. This podcast has been brought to you by the CASAT Podcast Network, located within the Center for the Application of Substance Abuse Technologies at the University of Nevada, Reno. For more podcasts, information, and resources, visit CASAT.org.